This video examines the trial-level case packet for Korematsu versus United States, which took place from 1942 to 1944 concerning wartime powers. The case involved defendant Fred Toyosaburo Korematsu in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California. He was charged with violating Civilian Exclusion Order No. 34 in the context of World War II and Executive Order 9066. The case arose from Civilian Exclusion Order No. 34, issued by the Western Defense Command and Fourth Army, which required all persons of Japanese ancestry to report for removal from specific areas. Fred Korematsu was charged with violating Civilian Exclusion Order No. 34, leading to his initial trial in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of California. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Executive Order 9066 led to Civilian Exclusion Order No. 34. Fred Korematsu, a U.S. citizen, refused to leave his home. The trial centered on whether wartime powers justified mass exclusion without individualized suspicion. The government's theory was that the president and military had broad wartime authority. They argued that exclusion orders were necessary to prevent espionage and sabotage, and courts must defer to military judgment for national security. Korematsu's defense theory was that mass exclusion based solely on race violated the Fifth Amendment. They argued that ancestry was used as a proxy for loyalty, and wartime powers cannot override constitutional protections without cause. The Federal District Court convicted Korematsu for violating Exclusion Order No. 34 after he refused to comply. The trial focused heavily on the government's wartime powers. The case centered on Fred Korematsu's constitutional rights and the government's actions during wartime. Korematsu's defense challenged the military exclusion orders as unconstitutional. They argued that the orders violated his rights, while the trial centered on the government's wartime powers. The case pitted individual rights against war powers. Korematsu challenged the orders' constitutionality, arguing they conflicted with Fifth Amendment due process. The government cited military necessity. The government's argument was supported by the Civilian Exclusion Order No. 34, which mandated the removal of all persons of Japanese ancestry from specific areas. The government's core argument cited national security concerns, claiming military necessity justified the exclusion of Japanese Americans. They argued Executive Order 9066 and the exclusion orders were a lawful exercise of war powers. The government asserted authority under war powers, basing exclusion orders on military necessity and national security concerns. Executive Order 9066 was deemed vital for national defense. The Federal District Court convicted Korematsu for violating Exclusion Order 34. The court upheld the government's wartime powers, prioritizing military necessity over individual rights. Government witnesses, including military officials, testified about national security threats, emphasizing potential espionage and sabotage dangers, and asserting deference to military judgment during wartime. Military officials justified the exclusion by testifying about national security threats. They focused on the necessity of exclusion orders and asserted deference to military judgment during wartime. General John L. DeWitt, who led the Western Defense Command, issued Civilian Exclusion Order No. 34. He argued the exclusion was a military necessity to prevent espionage and sabotage. Colonel Benditson, a key figure in the War Department's plan, explained the administrative basis for mass removal. His testimony supported the exclusion orders in court. Colonel Benditson, a key War Department figure, helped plan the mass removal of Japanese Americans. His trial testimony supported the military exclusion orders, explaining the administrative basis for the exclusion. FBI and naval intelligence testified in court, supporting the military's exclusion orders. Testimony highlighted alleged espionage and sabotage risks, asserting these threats justified the mass exclusion of citizens. Intelligence testimony from the FBI and naval intelligence supported exclusion orders. They focused on military necessity during wartime, asserting that alleged espionage and sabotage risks justified mass exclusion. Captain B.M. Bryan of the WCCA supported the exclusion orders. He testified about the alleged espionage threat, focusing on military necessity during the war to support the mass removal of Japanese Americans. Major Carl R. Benditson from the War Department helped design the mass removal program. He testified to support the exclusion orders, explaining the administrative necessity for the action. Benditson was a key architect of the exclusion program, overseeing the drafting and enforcing of the orders. He justified mass exclusion due to administrative necessity in the mass removal of citizens. Major General Alan W. Gullion advocated for the mass removal of Japanese Americans. His office coordinated security assessments and intelligence reports, supporting the Army's belief that exclusion was necessary for national security. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Ringel's report concluded most Japanese Americans were loyal. However, the government used his testimony to justify broad surveillance, arguing exclusion was a precautionary wartime measure due to potential espionage risks. The defense did not present specific witnesses, relying solely on legal constitutional arguments. Korematsu's attorneys challenged the exclusion based on racial bias and denied the government's broad wartime powers. Fred Korematsu, a loyal U.S. citizen, refused to leave his home. His defense centered on his constitutional rights, arguing against exclusion based solely on ancestry. The defense presented no specific factual or character witnesses, relying entirely on legal constitutional arguments. They challenged the exclusion based on racial bias and denied the government's wartime powers. The defense strategy focused heavily on legal constitutional arguments. Korematsu's attorneys challenged racial bias, denying the government's broad wartime powers, and arguing mass exclusion violated Fifth Amendment due process. The defense argued mass exclusion violated the Fifth Amendment due to racial bias. The government cited broad wartime authority and military necessity, emphasizing the trial centered on limiting individual rights for national security. This concludes the overview of the trial-level case for Korematsu versus United States.